Joining me now on Waterloo Live is Rachael Stark, Napoleon commentator and specialist on Napoleon's Marshals. Rachael, welcome. What's Grouchy's background before the Waterloo campaign? Because he's the most recently appointed of the Marshals when it comes to Waterloo, isn't he?
He is, and despite being so ignominiously tied to Waterloo, Grouchy's career prior to this is actually a long and consistently honourable one. Despite being the most blue-blooded of the marshalate, he fully embraces the philosophies of the revolution. He comes actually from quite an intellectual and progressive family, and very much follows the pattern. He stays behind in France when many others of his class flee into exile. He joins the Revolutionary Army, and his rise through the ranks is very rapid. He makes his name as a talented, reliable officer, commander of cavalry. And this is despite being viewed with some degree of suspicion by the Committee of Public Safety because he has that aristocratic background. But his progress is very successful. He is part of the failed invasion of Ireland in 1796, but the years that follow that are full of success stories. He performs particularly well at Novi and at Hohenlinden, and fantastically well at Eylau and Friedland. He was briefly in Spain, where he successfully put down insurrection there, performed again very, very well at Wagram, served in Russia, and then performed brilliantly in 1814. So his entire track record is a very solid, dependable, reliable officer who would do what he was asked to do. And he amassed, quite a number of wounds throughout that time. The last one being in Craon in 1814, that left him with a considerable limp. So this isn't the career of somebody who was shy of action or who hesitated to get involved in the battle. He was very much, like all the other marshals, a man who led from the front.
Yeah, as you say, a lot of how people like to perceive Grouchy is tainted by this long shadow of Waterloo, isn't it? Let's talk about his character and the way in which that influences how the Waterloo campaign unfolds, because Grouchy is a very particular type of commander and leader, isn't he?
He is, as I mentioned, he comes from a very intellectual, progressive, enlightened family, and his character reflects that. He's an intelligent man, he's a well-educated man, and in terms of character, he's comparably a lot quieter than a lot of the other personalities you see in the marshalate. He is none of the dash and flair and panache that inevitably draw people to the likes of Murat or Ney or Lang. So he's a much quieter sort of person, and contemporaries described him as having, excellent manners, extremely well bred, being very good, very amiable company. Complimentary accounts of him say that he actually was devoid of ego or pride, which is a definite rarity in the marshalate. Less complimentary accounts describe him as a sort of a weaker or indecisive character, and obviously that's the way he's painted at Waterloo. But as I've mentioned, he was solid, he was reliable, he wasn't what we'd call an imaginative commander necessarily. He had none of that sort of intuitive brilliance for independent command that we associate with Davout or Lang or Massena. And there are distinct personality clashes we see at Waterloo with some of his subordinates, the more dynamic subordinates like Van Damme, who probably would have respected him a lot more had he been a bit more of the Ney or Murat school of commander. But Grouchy stuck to Napoleon's orders by the letter, vague as they were. He stuck to what he interpreted he was meant to do. And in his meetings with his subordinates, he made it clear that he found it absolutely unthinkable that he would deviate from what the emperor has asked him to do. That is his honor as a commander is to follow his instructions. And, he would not let the emperor down by deviating from them. And bear in mind, Napoleon's not a man who up until now has generally been very complimentary with the marshals when they've gone off and done their own thing. So you could say that inflexibility maybe was a bit of a flaw, but that inflexibility meant that he was able to lead a successful action at Wavre, pretty much the only success of the Waterloo campaign as far as the French are concerned, and he was able to get his troops back to Paris as a result, undefeated. So, yes, possibly a bit inflexible, but ultimately that worked out to the benefit for his men.
You've touched on this already, but I want to drill into that kind of Waterloo controversy since you've raised it. It's often claimed he should have marched to the sound of the guns, isn't it? Give us your thoughts on the whole kind of convoluted picture that is that debate.
Well, I mean, this has been debated almost since the last gun stopped at Waterloo. It's been debated for centuries. I don't imagine that's going to stop anytime soon. But as far as I'm concerned, Grouchy did what he was asked to. He followed orders. The fact that he was sent off far too late and in the direction that he went in isn't at the fault, it doesn't lie at his feet. The Waterloo campaign had, a whole host of problems, most notably communication errors. But ultimately, again, that's not Grouchy's fault. You could say, with some justification, he could have moved a little bit quicker. He could have spread his men out instead of having 25,000 troops following the same avenue of advance. So possibly he could have moved with a bit more alacrity. But sticking to his orders and not racing off to the sound of the guns because, it might have been a battle. I mean, that sounds military logic ultimately. And again, as I've already said, the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars has not seen any point where Napoleon's been pleased to see people deviate from his plans. Obviously up until 1813, 14, and of course 1812, usually Napoleon's plans had paid off, but he liked things done his way, exactly as he'd instructed and in the manner that he had instructed. So Grouchy's very much sticking to type. But even if he had marched off to the sound of the guns, the fact is he could not have got there in time to have made any difference. And, historians have actually gone and walked that route, moving faster than an armed column would have been expected to go, and have timed it, and he couldn't have got there to change the outcome of the battle. So he becomes a very useful punching bag for people who adore Napoleon, but he wasn't going to make a difference either way. The fact that his successful action at Wavre and managing to get the troops back to Paris, that's the element that should be focused on. That's where he should be getting the credit. And I honestly think the Waterloo movie, which portrays him as a sort of bumbling, incompetent idiot, actually had a lot to answer for in the way that Grouchy is perceived now, because he was far from an idiot. And he comes out of there with pretty much the only French success story.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of really key points there, which is, he's the man who gets a chunk of his forces out, which is a significant achievement, and out in a cohesive way. His forces are not broken, unlike those that fight at Waterloo. And equally, the Prussians have a head start on Grouchy. And there's no way that he can kind of get there faster than they can, because they've been marching for hours before Grouchy even comes up to what becomes the battlefield of Wavre. He is, though, in some cases, his own worst enemy, isn't he, when it comes to defending his reputation? Explain to our viewers why that's the case.
Yeah, he does sadly do himself an ultimate disservice. So after Waterloo, Grouchy, like Marshal Ney, and like a good number of other Bonapartist officers, is prescribed for treason. And with a sight more self-preservation than Ney, he makes for America. He goes into exile. And while he is in America, he arrives in early 1816 and eventually resides in Philadelphia. He hears the first accounts that come out of St. Helena that Napoleon is laying the defeat at Waterloo pretty much at his feet, and he talks about Grouchy's imbecility, and it really devastates him, possibly not unsurprisingly. Bear in mind, the man is in exile at the moment as a result of his loyalty to Napoleon, and that gets flung back in his face. He's a man who has just followed every instruction Napoleon has given him, and again is being castigated for that. So he wants to try and write his own account to try and clear his name, to defend his honor, which is something that means a great deal to him. again, pretty understandable. Unfortunately, writing it as he does in America without access to a good number of his papers, without his correspondence, and at a distance of a couple of years, his account's actually full of errors. And people, of course, pounce on these as evidence. Well, he's not even listing, the dates or the times right. So clearly he is an idiot. Clearly Napoleon's right. And it's really, really unfortunate that he's doing his best to clear his name and actually making things worse.
Yeah, as you say, it's unfortunate, isn't it? And there's a very clear theme emerging through this interview. Grouchy's the scapegoat here, which is obviously consistent with a lot of the other discussions and insights that we've been having over the course of the day. Tell us a little bit about what his life is like beyond Waterloo. Does he ever make it back to France?
He does, yeah. He resides in America for a few years, where he was actually very warmly welcomed and very well received. In fact, he socialised mostly with other French exiles when he was there. He was joined by quite a number of Bonapartist officers. He eventually did distance himself from some of the most vehement Bonapartists, which is possibly not to be surprising given the way that his name was besmirched. And during that time, he corresponded with Thomas Jefferson and, who wrote of Grouchy in the warmest possible terms, looked forward to meeting him. But he got an amnesty from Louis in 1819 and was able to return to France the following year. He didn't get his marshalate back, though, and he didn't get his peerage back when he returned to France. It was another decade before those were restored to him by Louis Philippe. And Grouchy found himself being in the really unfortunate position that he spent basically the rest of his life having to defend his actions at Waterloo and having to defend himself ultimately to both sides, because the royalists always viewed him as the traitor who'd gone to join Bonaparte, and the Bonapartists viewed him as the reason that Napoleon had lost. So he sort of was, looked down on by all sides, which is a fairly unhappy place to be. And that's kind of how he's still viewed today, despite the fact that, I've just talked about how well he performed at Freeland or at Eylau, etc. You think of Grouchy, or when most people think of Grouchy, they automatically think of Waterloo. Despite everything else he'd done in his career, he's associated with that one, defeat. And it really is undeserved. He lost his wife in 1827, married a much younger woman very scandalously quickly, to the point his late wife's family became estranged from him as a result. He's one of the few marshals, or a handful of marshals, who survived long enough to see Napoleon's remains repatriated to France in 1840. But he died in 1847 at the age of 80, and like most of the marshals, he is buried in Père Lachaise, where you can find his tomb today.
Fantastic. Is part of just to touch on the thing that you raised in relation to how Waterloo eclipses everything, is part of the issue for Grouchy that it's his first campaign as a marshal, and so it's not like some of the others who have this sort of track record that they can draw on, and therefore Waterloo looks like the exception.
Yeah, I mean, he has no Erstadt or Austerlitz to tie to his name. He gets a baton from Napoleon. I mean, deservedly so. You could argue that there's a lot of deserving generals, but, Grouchy's not an undeserving one. Unfortunately, he gets his baton and everything goes south.
Rachael Stark, Napoleonic commentator and specialist on Napoleon's marshals. We will see you again a little bit later to talk about Ney, but for now, thanks very much for your time and for joining us here on Waterloo Live.
Thank you.